Everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Heidi from My Reading Life, and I'm here today to film a recent reads video. So this will wrap up all of the rest of the books that I have read in the month of January. Since the last time I did a recent reads video, it's today, Sunday, January 31st, and I'm not going to finish any more books today. So I figured now would be a good time to sort of wrap January up and get moving on February. So the first thing I want to talk about is the latest issue of The Atlantic that I read about. Some of you have asked if I'm still reading The Atlantic, and I am, and over the last several months I have been buddy reading The Atlantic with Britta Bowler, and it's been fabulous. And I specifically wanted to shout out this issue, the cover story, The Last Children of Down Syndrome. Prenatal testing is changing who gets born and who doesn't. This is just the beginning, by Sarah Zhang. And this article was really fascinating, especially from the perspective of an American reader, because it details what's happening in the Netherlands, I believe, if I remember correctly. And in the Netherlands, is it the Netherlands? I'm pretty sure it's the Netherlands. Nope, sorry, Denmark. In Denmark, there is universal prenatal testing, and people can decide at that point, based on what happens with that testing, whether or not they want to proceed with the pregnancy. And because of that, the number of children born with Down syndrome has gone down and down and down, to the point where I think it's like only less than 20 or less than 10 or something like that are being born each year. And so then that raises the moral and ethical question of, aren't we just basically selectively breeding people? And there's some moral and ethical questions around that. I think the article does a really excellent job of addressing those questions and bringing in historical information about genetic testing and where the science is and where sort of law and policy is, comparing Denmark with, like, say, America, and maybe some other, I think there were a couple other countries that get discussed here. There are a few case studies discussed in this article of families who have children with Down syndrome, and then some folks who chose not to continue the pregnancy when they found out they were at high risk of having a child with Down syndrome. So it's really, really a fantastic article. A lot to chew on, a lot to think about. So I will link this article down below in the description box, and I would encourage you to check that out. For the books that I finished in the second half of January, the first one was the address book, What Street Addresses Reveal About Identity, Race, Wealth, and Power, by Deirdre Mask. So this is a nonfiction that I finished a couple days ago. This is Cuba, A History by Richard Gott, and this is a highly detailed, very dense nonfiction book, very academic, all about the history of Cuba from the very, very earliest days until the present day. And no detail is left out of this history, I will tell you. It is this edition is really hard to read simply because the text is incredibly small, very little white space, little margins. So that made it really, a difficult book to physically read. And it was also a book that you had to really concentrate on because there's so many names, names of people, names of places, dates, and things that are included, and it makes it, it can be a tiring read. So this wasn't entirely successful for me, but what I did find was that as the book progressed and we got closer and closer to modern day history, I found it much more engaging and much more, I wanted to pick it up and read it. So like the last few chapters are about Cuba, and then, of course it's about Cuba, about Castro and the revolution, and then once Castro was in power, the relationship of Cuba with the Soviet Union, how Cuba, the U.S. isolated Cuba in order to, so they say, stop the spread of communism in the Western Hemisphere, and what impact that played on the people of Cuba. It was really interesting. The author is, I believe, British, and this book has a distinctly anti-American tone, and so it was interesting for me as an American to read this book and to get that perspective of how our policy since the early 1900s of sort of isolating Cuba, how that impacted the people that live in Cuba, and how that impacted the government of Cuba and the choices that they made to try to build a society and a nation in the face of this intense pressure from a huge, a sort of global superpower. Tiny little Cuba was able to, sort of follow their own path. And whether or not you agree with all the decisions that were made and the route that they chose to take, they did it their way, as the song goes. And I think there's a lot to admire with that. I'm not saying I agree with everything Castro decided to do. I think there was some questionable choices made there, but I admire the sort of the spirit of the revolution and the desire to forge a path that was their own and not anybody else's. I think, they weren't able to be as successful as they wanted to be, and there's some horrible stories in amongst there, and some interesting stories too about sort of the racial divide in Cuba between so-called white Spanish Cubans and black Cubans, and how divisive those two groups have been over time. I thought that was quite interesting as well. So I can't wholeheartedly recommend this, just because I think it's a really difficult book to read, and I don't think most people are going to want to read such a dense piece of nonfiction. But I am glad that I read it, because I feel like I have a much more solid grounding in Cuban history at this point. So yeah, that's where I stand with that one. So the next book in the Bridgerton series that I finished with my buddy readers Doris and Katie is It's in His Kiss by Julia Quinn. This is book number 7 in the Bridgerton series, and this tells the story of Hyacinth, who is the youngest Bridgerton, and her relationship with Gareth St. Clair, who is the heir to a I can't remember what his father's title was, but he is an aristocrat, and but there's some family history there that has to be dealt with. And Hyacinth is a very interesting character. We hadn't learned very much about Hyacinth in the previous books because she was so young, especially in the earliest books of the series. But now she's grown up, and she is a woman who speaks her mind, and damn the consequences. So it has left her without any prospects really for marriage. It's not that people don't like her, everyone likes her, but no men seem to want to be married to her because she's so opinionated and not afraid to tell you what she thinks. I think she's delightful, and she has a lovely relationship with Lady Danbury, who we've met in earlier books, and I really enjoyed that aspect of their relationship, almost a grandmother-granddaughter relationship, which was fun. And Hyacinth sort of leads Gareth on a merry chase as he tries to reconcile her personality with what he expects of his own life. And I really enjoyed this reread of It's in His Kiss. I did not really remember this story from when I read it previously, so it was almost like reading a brand new book for me, and I found it just delightful. All of the Bridgerton books are just great. You can't go wrong with reading them if you're looking to get into a romance series. I then finished Mouse 2 by Art Spiegelman. This is a graphic novel of Art Spiegelman telling his father's story of living through World War II as he's from Poland, and he gets put into a concentration camp. And so this volume 2 is really the story of what happens to Art's father in the concentration camp and to the end of the war, and then his subsequent immigration to the United States. Harrowing, emotionally disturbing. I read it this time during the daytime, so that was a much better choice for me. I'm really glad that I did that. Everything that everybody says about these graphic novels is absolutely, I should say graphic memoirs, is absolutely true. They're really difficult to read, but important. I did get a lot of insight from this book. One thing that I think is really striking about this series is the relationship between Art and his father. They do not have a good relationship. There's a lot of tension between them. Art Spiegelman is mad at his father for what has happened in their family, what happened with his mother. I don't want to get into all that, but the tension and the relationship between father and son here, I think, adds depth and nuance to this story. So it's not just a straight telling of what happened to this man in the Holocaust, but also what happened afterwards and how his experiences in the Holocaust shaped a man's life and shaped how he interacted with his family. And I think that really is what makes this book stand out from any other historical telling of the Holocaust that you would read. So I'm on the bandwagon. This is fantastic. And then the last book I finished in the month of January is a book of middle grade poetry. This is The Surrender Tree: Poems of Cuba's Struggle for Freedom by Margarita Engle. Now, I read a book, I think I've read 2 books now by Margarita Engle, and she writes middle grade poetry books about historical time periods I read one about the construction of the Panama Canal, and the story is told from the people who are working on the canal and the animals in the path of the canal. That one was amazing. I think I read another one, which I can't recall at this moment, but this one is about Cuba, obviously, and Cuba's struggles. These poems all take place prior to the U.S. sort of intervening in Cuba in 1898, 1900 time period. That book ends at that point. And so this is all about Cuba's basically internal wars where Black Cubans were trying to throw off the bonds of slavery and gain their freedom. And so you're hearing from a woman who lives in the mountains and is a healer, and she is healing not only the folks in her community who are fighting for freedom, but she's also healing the Spanish soldiers that are fighting to keep them enslaved, because that's what she feels like she has to do. She has to heal everyone. And then you're also hearing from the point of view of a couple of the Spanish soldiers, and from the healer's husband, and then a young woman who, towards the end of the story is being taught by the healer. Rosa is the healer. And it sort of tells the perspective of the Cubans, it tells the perspective of the Spanish soldiers, and you're getting the history from all these perspectives in poetry form. And it is just beautiful and touching, and this really rounded out what I learned in the Cuban history book, the piece of nonfiction. Like this is the heart, right? This is the emotion and what the people were feeling during all these historical events that were discussed in the Cuba history. So I think that this book paired with that book was just an excellent pairing to have in this month, and I really love this. I think I want to read everything that Margarita Engle has written, because she is just a fabulous author. And I want to thank Doris for picking Cuba as her theme for January, because I would have never probably gotten to read anything about Cuba. It wasn't like on my radar particularly, and I'm really glad to have read and learned about that region, because I really didn't know very much at all beyond the remember the Maine slogan and sort of those basic historical footnotes. Anyway, very successful reading of Cuban history this month. So that's it. That's what I've read in January. So that was a total of 12 books read in the month, putting the 2 groups of books together that I've discussed. So that feels very good to me, because a lot of these books were really long and dense. So I'm feeling really happy with my progress. I hope that you have all found some great books to read in the month of January, and I will talk to you later.